Holmes, the premier male film star of the 70s and early 80s, made hundreds of explicit films in his career. Reports tonight say Holmes died just after 1 o'clock this morning.
He wasn't just a star. John Holmes was rich, wild, and irreplaceable for years. He was the leading man of the golden era, dominating his place in the adult film industry. But off-camera, his life told a much darker story. Behind the charm was a man spiraling out of control, trapped in addiction, and even worse, tangled in lies and bloodshed.
This year, but they have not said what, if anything, he revealed.
40 years after his death, the truth is finally surfacing. From Hollywood royalty to a killing that still haunts everyone involved. This is the chilling story behind the man everyone thought they knew. The making of a superstar. Before he became Johnny Wad, and before he became a legend in a hidden part of Hollywood, John Holmes was just a regular guy from Ohio. His early life was about as ordinary as it gets. He was a high school dropout who bounced from one job to the next, and for a while he was a shoe salesman. At a point in his life, he took a job as an ambulance driver so he could make a living. Never in his wildest imagination did he believe he would be famous, let alone become a star. He was just that regular guy trying to figure out his life, doing jobs that didn't cover his bills. Knowing that these menial jobs weren't enough, he was on the lookout for more jobs, or a breakaway from his usual daily routine. And then, as life sometimes happens, he found this break in the most unexpected of places. Believe it or not, Holmes's big break came in a poker room bathroom when he met a curious photographer. This stranger saw something in him, something that had little to do with talent or charm. The photographer recognized a physical trait in Holmes that was difficult to overlook while both men stood side by side at a restroom urinal that was perfect for a new and rapidly growing adult film industry. It was the kind of job Holmes never would have dreamed of, but it was a chance to make good and fast money easily. He went for it, and just like that, his normal life was over. The 1970s was a wild time, as a wave of social liberation and a countercultural movement were in full swing. Anything was possible, and the adult film scene was a huge part of that. It was the golden age, and Holmes was about to become its biggest star. And before you knew it, he completely took over in a short time. John Holmes became Johnny Wad, a private detective with a very specific line of work. The character was a huge hit. He was a cool, confident guy who solved problems in the bedroom. His fans loved him. He was an unforgettable figure who starred in hundreds of films. His face was everywhere, from steamy magazines to stag films. He was famous not just for his looks. He also had a charisma that made people want to watch him. Not only that, but he was funny, engaging, and also hard-working. He made over 500 films in a relatively short time, which is just an unbelievable amount of work. From there on, there was no disputing that he was a star and the face of the entire industry for a while. He became so popular that he showed up as a guest on talk shows, where he told a lot of stories about himself, claiming he had a degree from UCLA and making up crazy tales about his life. He built a myth around himself that was as big as his on-screen character. He was the king, and for a while, it seemed like he could do no wrong. But being king in a world of shadows came with a heavy cost. With all that attention came a new kind of temptation, a life of extreme excess that would push John Holmes down a very dangerous road far from the movie sets he used to dominate. The spiral downwards. John Holmes loved the high life, and for a while, he lived like a true movie star. He had money to throw around, and he did it with a flair that became his trademark. He would splurge on the most luxurious cars, throw and attend a stream of wild parties, and show up at all the hottest clubs in Los Angeles. People who were around him back then remember him as the guy who always had a crowd that always had the best of everything. He was a walking example of the kind of success people dream about. It became so bad that he would often show up late to film sets, and even when he showed up at all, it was because he knew they couldn't finish the movie without him. He felt untouchable, and for a long time he was. He couldn't get enough of the money, fame, and of course the parties, and the gag was after every party. The next had to be bigger and better. And he went on with this lifestyle for a really, really long time. To a lot of people, he was doing a lot more than having fun. He was being wasteful, and this lifestyle grew with every passing day. This way of life led him directly into the world of substance abuse, specifically party pills. Initially, it was just part of the party scene, something everyone was doing in Hollywood back then. But for Holmes, it quickly moved from a casual habit to a full-blown addiction that took over his life. By the late 1970s, his huge income wasn't even close to being enough to keep up with his addiction to high-powered stimulants. It was insane to think that the king of the adult film industry, who was making $3,000 every single day, was blowing it all on controlled substances. And before everyone knew what was happening, his addiction began to completely consume his life and destroy his career. He became unreliable, showing up to film sets unable to perform. In no time, he started losing jobs, and his once stellar reputation was in shambles. His charismatic nature, that had made him a star, began to fade away under the shadow of his addiction. He was no longer the Johnny Wad everyone knew. He was just a desperate man chasing his next high. As the money ran, the jobs dried up. Holmes became a different person entirely. The adult industry tycoon had to find new ways to make cash, and they were all a world away from the glamorous movie sets he once ruled. He started selling illicit substances to his former friends and co-workers just to scrape together a few bucks. He went from selling to petty thefts, stealing things just to get enough money for his next dose. The most shocking part was that he began selling himself on the streets to both men and women who would pay enough to have him for the night. The man who had been at the very top of his game was now a street-level hustler, a mere shadow of his former self. It was a total and complete fall from grace, and he was in so deep there was no way out, only further down the rabbit hole. It was during this low point that he crossed paths with a young girl named Dawn Schiller, who was only 15 years old. He met her and, in a twisted kind of way, took her under his wing. He groomed her, pulling her into his chaotic life of addiction and crime. Dawn's first-hand experience is a critical piece of what he had turned into, because she saw everything and witnessed his manipulative and abusive behavior. He had terrifying mood swings and was violent towards her. He was not the Johnny Wad she thought he would be, but someone deep in a toxic lifestyle who had dragged her into hell. With all his money and fame gone, his life was completely controlled by a desperate need that would push him into even darker corners of Los Angeles. He was now a criminal, a thief, and someone deeply caught up in the street life, with no loyalty left to anyone but his need for the lifestyle that came with it. His addiction didn't just cost him his career, it led him into an even more dangerous world, a world where the stakes were life and death. The Wonderland Gang and the underworld of Los Angeles. John Holmes's questionable habit went beyond manageable. He was willing to do anything humanly possible to get his next high. This desperation led him to a house on Wonderland Avenue, which was a place that was known as the center of an illegal business operation. This kind of place wasn't the kind of casual party spot he was used to. This well-covered operation was run by a group of ruthless dealers known as the Wonderland Gang. The people there were the kinds of guys no one would dare to mess with, and they were all about business. This operation was led by Ron Lius, a violent and cunning criminal. His main man was Billy Deverell, a big, intimidating guy who was just as dangerous. The gang also included Joy Miller, Ron's wife, and David Lind. These people were serious criminals who ran a high-level black market trade ring out in the area. For them, John Holmes wasn't a celebrity, but a valuable asset, a tool they could use to run their business. John Holmes became a regular face at the Wonderland house. His role was much more than just a customer. He became a link between the gang and the top Hollywood circles they couldn't access. His celebrity status, at least what was left of it anyway, gave him a kind of street credibility and access that the gang members didn't have. He was a user, a middleman, and an informant. And just like that, he got caught up deeper in a web of criminal activities. He was their connection to the highbrow areas of town, which they saw as a gold mine for their business. Holmes ran errands for them and did whatever they asked, all in exchange for the substances he so desperately wanted. He became a pawn in their game and was too desperate and too high to realize how dangerous the game would get. This criminal world ran on hierarchy, and each stash house had a king of its own. This person was far more feared than any member of a gang. In this case, it was Eddie Nash. He was a well-known nightclub owner and a major illicit substance kingpin in Los Angeles who controlled a huge part of the city's illicit business. It was hard to tell that he was affiliated with such a dangerous trade because of how charismatic he was, but when it got to business, he was a completely ruthless person who didn't tolerate being crossed. He and Holmes had crossed paths because Eddie was a big fan of adult films, and who better to set him up with women in exchange for a stash than Holmes? The Wonderland Gang operated on his every command, and while they had their own business, they were always in his shadow. Even before John came into the picture, there had always been constant tension and a fragile truce between the two groups. All they operated on was an arrangement of mutual respect built on fear. Holmes, in his desperate need for his fix and money, was now caught right in the middle. He was walking between the devil and the deep blue sea, trying to please both sides without getting crushed by either one. His addiction had stripped him of his judgment and loyalty, making him a perfect target for manipulation by everyone. He was playing with fire, and it was only a matter of time before he got burned. John Holmes was now walking a tightrope between two criminal empires, an act that was about to come crashing down with a single fateful decision: the robbery and the betrayal. After Holmes's fall from grace in the film industry, he still continued to be the link of the supply chain to top officials in Hollywood. And later on, he would use some of the controlled substances he was supposed to sell off. This took a bad turn when he realized he was in trouble. He owed a ton of money to the Wonderland Gang for all the controlled substances he'd used, and now he was on thin ice. Not only did he become a shadow of himself, because no celebrity wanted to be seen with him, but he also became a liability to the gang. In order to get back in their good graces, he came up with a bold plan and a high-stakes gamble to solve all his problems at once. He would give the gang an easy way to rob his other dealers and the powerful and dangerous nightclub owner Eddie Nash. His plan was to set up the heist. He knew Nash's routine, the layout of his house, and where the valuables were kept. Holmes saw it as the perfect solution to his money problems, and most especially an easy way to pay the debt he owed the Wonderland Gang and have all the controlled substances he could ever want. He thought he was playing a brilliant game, but it was really a fatal miscalculation. The robbery went down on the night of June 29, 1981. Holmes had been at Nash's house earlier, and he'd made sure to leave a sliding glass door unlocked. The gang, led by Ron Lius and Billy Deverell, broke into Nash's home. What was supposed to be a quiet job soon turned into a shootout. There was a confrontation between Nash's bodyguard and a member of the Wonderland Gang, which led to the bodyguard getting harmed. The gang quickly grabbed stacks of money, a significant amount of controlled substances, jewelry, and anything valuable they could find, worth over $1 million. They got away with a huge haul, and it was all thanks to the inside information from Holmes. The gang rewarded him by giving him a small cut of the loot, and, more importantly, a large pile of controlled substances. Holmes thought he was safe, and he had outsmarted everyone, but he was wrong. The next morning, when Eddie Nash found out what had happened, he was furious and completely humiliated. He knew immediately that the robbery was an inside job. Someone had to have given them the details of his house, and he knew exactly who it was. There was only one person who had been there that day and who also knew the Wonderland crew: John Holmes. Nash found Holmes and, in a fit of rage, brought him in for a brutal interrogation. Nash and his goons tortured Holmes, holding him for hours, demanding to know the names of the people who had robbed him. The pressure was immense, and Holmes, who had sustained injuries from the beatings, was terrified and eventually gave in. He pointed the finger at the Wonderland Gang, and in that moment, he sealed their fate. He had gone from the king of the adult film industry to a terrified snitch, a weak link who had just betrayed the wrongest of persons. What happened next remains one of the most brutal and baffling crimes in Los Angeles history. And John Holmes was at its very center: the Wonderland killings. Nash wasn't the kind of man anyone could easily steal from and get away with it. In his world, humiliation was a weakness, and he had to make a point, a loud and clear message to anyone else who might ever consider crossing him. He already knew who the thieves were, and it was time for his revenge. What he did would become one of the infamous nights of retribution. In the very early hours of July 1, 1981, just 2 days after the robbery, a horrific scene unfolded at the Wonderland Avenue townhouse. The Wonderland Gang members, who were wasted and high on the very stash they had stolen from Nash, were caught unawares. In the early hours of the morning, a group of men, possibly led by Nash himself, or acting on his direct orders, broke into the house. What followed was a savage and completely brutal attack. They used heavy objects like hammers and lead pipes to bludgeon the victims who met their untimely ends in their beds. The killings were enough warnings passed to the other members of the gang. The 4 people who lost their lives were Ron, Billy Deverell, and another woman named Barbara Richardson. The killers didn't stop there. Ron's wife, Susan Lius, whose skull was bashed, but by some miracle she survived. She was left with severe head injuries which caused her to have amnesia for the rest of her life. So even though she was the only living witness, unfortunately for her, and fortunately for Nash and his men, she couldn't remember a single thing about the gory event. The police arrived on the scene and were met with pure horror. The level of violence was so extreme that it was obvious it only had to be a personal and vengeful attack and not a random act of crime. Detectives began to piece together what happened, and one key piece of evidence quickly pointed to a shocking possibility. A partial palm print was found on the headboard of one of the beds. The print was later matched to none other than John Holmes. The discovery of his palm print at the crime scene completely changed everything for the investigation. He was no longer just a desperate addict caught between 2 dangerous groups. He was now officially a prime suspect in a quadruple killing. He became the only person to physically link the robbery and the killings in a way that the police could see with concrete evidence. The criminal case turned into a shocking mystery with a former movie star at the center of it all. The public couldn't get enough of the story, and the case became a media sensation. The pressure was on for the police to find out what really happened and what part John Holmes had played in the deadly events. The massacre sent shockwaves through Hollywood's underbelly. But the biggest question of all was, what was John Holmes's exact role in the killings? Especially with his palm print right there at the crime scene. With his palm print tying him to the disturbing scene, John Holmes became a star on the run. He wasn't just hiding from the police, he was also terrified of Eddie Nash, the man he had betrayed. He and his young girlfriend, Dawn Schiller, took off and fled Los Angeles. They moved from city to city, trying to outrun both the police and the dangerous people who wanted him dead. He was now a fugitive who was constantly looking over his shoulder. He and Dawn were living a life full of fear and substance abuse, with no real plan and nowhere safe to go. During this time, he became more violent towards Dawn and had increasing paranoia. Meanwhile, the Los Angeles Police Department was hot on his trail. The Wonderland case was huge, and top investigators and a team of relentless detectives, including Tom Lang and Frank Tomlinson, who had previously worked on the infamous Hillside Stranglers case, were determined to get to the bottom of it. They believed Holmes was more than a witness but a prime suspect in the killings. They knew he was the missing link between the robbery and the killings. They followed every lead, interviewed everyone connected to Holmes, and put a full-court press on finding him. The detectives saw through his flimsy stories and knew he was lying. Whenever they got close to catching him, Holmes would tell a different story. He would call detectives and friends from payphones, giving conflicting accounts of what happened. Sometimes he would paint himself as an innocent bystander, a terrified man forced to watch the killings unfold. Other times, he would hint at a more involved role, trying to gain some kind of leverage. He was caught in a web of his own lies, and his stories changed with his mood and his desperation. He was trying to protect himself from the police, Eddie Nash, and even the truth. The 5 years on the run finally ended in December of 1981. After a tip, police tracked Holmes down, arrested him in a motel in Florida, and took him back to Los Angeles. The once famous adult film star, now a shadow of himself, was finally in police custody, facing some of the most serious charges a person can face. Now, the adult entertainment mogul would be on trial for his life, and his testimony, or lack of it, would prove to be the most critical moment in his downfall. The trial and acquittal. The Los Angeles courtroom was packed every day with reporters, camera crews, and curious onlookers filling the seats, eager to witness the fall of the man once known as Johnny Wad. The prosecution was ready, and their case was straightforward. They told the jury that John Holmes was a willing accomplice, a man who actively set up his friends to be robbed. They argued that he then took part in the killings as a way to make up with the powerful Eddie Nash. The prosecution's star witness, so to speak, was the physical evidence itself, Holmes's left palm print, found on a headboard in one of the bedrooms where the victims were harmed. For them, this was concrete proof that he was inside the house while the killings were happening. They painted a picture of a desperate man who, in a terrible moment of choice, had picked loyalty to a dangerous kingpin over the lives of his friends. They believed he had walked into that house knowing full well what was about to happen. The story was simple, believable, and compelling. But the defense had a very different story to tell, and their strategy was brilliant. They didn't try to say Holmes wasn't there. They couldn't, because of the palm print. Instead, they painted Holmes not as a suspect, but as a victim himself. They argued that he was a man lost to addiction, who had been completely controlled by ruthless perpetrators. His lawyers claimed that his palm print was there because he was forced to be there, a terrified man who had no choice but to lead the perpetrators to the front door. They explained that his refusal to testify was not a sign of guilt, but a sign of his immense fear for his own life and the lives of his loved ones. They made the case that he was a man who, after being brutally tortured by Nash's men, was too scared to name the real perpetrators. The defense team created just enough reasonable doubt. They argued that their client was not a ruthless attacker, but simply a scared, helpless pawn caught in a deadly game he couldn't escape. The trial lasted for 3 intense weeks, and it was a media circus every single day. The jury heard from many witnesses, examined all the evidence, and was presented with 2 completely different versions of the truth. After much deliberation, the verdict came in. It was a shocking moment for many in the courtroom. The jury acquitted John Holmes of all 4 killing charges. The courtroom erupted with a mix of gasps and sighs. The decision left a lot of people, including the victims' families, completely devastated, feeling that justice had not been served. The case was left without a clear conclusion, a brutal crime with no one held accountable. The adult industry tycoon had walked free, but he was far from being truly free. The shadow of the killings would follow him for the rest of his life. Even though he had won in court, his reputation was ruined, and nobody wanted anything to do with him anymore. He went from being famous to being known for all the wrong reasons, and it followed him everywhere. The verdict may have cleared him in the eyes of the law, but in the court of public opinion and in the dark corners of Hollywood, the truth was something else entirely. The final years and confessions. Holmes was finally a free man, but his acquittal didn't give him his old life back. The fame was gone, his career was over, and the shadow of the Wonderland killings followed him everywhere he went. He tried to find work, but no one wanted to be associated with him. His addiction didn't go away just because the trial was over. It became even worse as he sank into a deep depression. He was an outcast, alone with his addiction and his dark secrets. In the mid-80s, his life took an even more tragic turn when he got diagnosed with. As his health failed, he became frail and weak, a ghost of the person he once was. As his life was coming to an end, a new chapter of the Wonderland saga began to unfold. On his deathbed, Holmes, on his sickbed, had called in the same detectives who had tried to convict him. He was ready to confess everything about what had gone down on the night of the Wonderland killing. In a series of interviews and a tell-all book manuscript, he finally admitted his true horrifying role in the killings. He confessed that he was present at the killings and that he let the perpetrators in. Even though he didn't bludgeon anyone himself, he said, he was there and witnessed the whole tragic incident. It was his final confession and a last attempt to clear his conscience. He later died on March 13, 1988, from related complications. But even in death, John Holmes's name still lingered with the Wonderland killings, especially because of the chilling revelation that would come from his own lips. Even with his death and his confession, the mystery of the Wonderland killings isn't quite finished. While his role is now widely accepted by everyone, the killings themselves technically remain unsolved. No one was ever convicted for the actual fatal attacks. Eddie Nash was later charged but was acquitted. The case has never been definitively closed. Hollywood, however, has been obsessed with his story. The famous film Boogie Nights, which came out in 1997, drew heavily from his rise and fall, turning his tragic life into a fictionalized, epic drama. Then, in 2003, the more direct film Wonderland, starring Val Kilmer, brought the real story to the big screen, exploring the grisly details of the crime and Holmes's involvement. In the end, John Holmes was a man of two very different parts. He was the charming, celebrated king of adult film, whose career spanned 20 years with over 274 hardcore adult films, as well as intimacy with 14,000 women. On the flip side, he was also a desperate criminal lost to addiction who helped contribute to the horrific tragedy. The dirty secrets that have come to light over the past 4 decades offer us a much more complete, if much more disturbing, picture of the man. Fame was always a lie, a thin cover for a dark and complicated truth. What do you think really happened that night at Wonderland Avenue? Was John Holmes a victim or a willing participant? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell for more content like this. To see more of your favorite celebrities on our channel, click on the next video on your screen to watch more videos like this one.